Nearly 1,400 feet below sea level sits the lowest point on any continent. The water is so salty, a person cannot even fully sink into it. Getting a splash in the eyes can blind someone. So for most of history, almost nobody dove beneath the surface. In 2010, a small team finally did anyway. What they pulled up from the bottom is still reshaping what scientists thought they knew. The night the sea turned itself inside out. For roughly 300 years, the Dead Sea sat quietly in one of the most stable arrangements found in any lake on the planet. Its water formed two separate layers that never mixed. A lighter layer sat on top, refreshed by the Jordan River flowing in every year. Beneath it sat an ancient, heavier layer of brine that had not touched open air in centuries. Scientists call this kind of permanent layering meramixis. It is rare, and it usually only survives when nothing disturbs the balance for a very long time. Back in the 1930s, researchers at Hebrew University had already noticed something odd about this supposedly lifeless lake. Even then, they realized the name Dead Sea was not quite accurate, since small numbers of microorganisms clearly survived in its water. Nobody paid the observation much attention. The lake's layered structure seemed permanent, and permanent things rarely attract urgent research funding. That permanence broke in the winter of 1978. Water had been diverted from the Jordan River for decades to supply farms and cities, so less fresh water reached the lake each year. The top layer grew saltier and heavier with every passing season until it finally matched the density of the ancient layer sitting below it. In February of 1979, the entire lake turned over in one continuous motion, mixing top and bottom for the first time in roughly 3 centuries. The ancient bottom layer, with its own distinct chemistry built up since before recorded history, was gone the moment the water mixed. Researchers who had spent years measuring that deep, untouched brine watched it vanish into the rest of the lake within weeks. It has never settled back the same way since. The lake has since flipped between stable and mixed states several more times, but never for as long as it once held steady. That single event marked the moment the Dead Sea stopped behaving like the lake generations of scientists had studied. It also set off changes to the water structure that are still playing out today. What happened to the lake right after that turnover explains why studying it only got harder from there. The sea that split into two, losing its ancient deep layer, was only the beginning. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the Jordan River kept losing water to farms, cities, and 3 different countries that all depend on it. What used to flow into the Dead Sea at close to 2 billion cubic meters a year dropped to a small fraction of that amount, with some estimates putting the current flow at only around 1/5 of its historical volume. With less water coming in and constant evaporation under the desert sun, the lake began shrinking by close to 1 meter of depth every single year. That drop has continued for decades, and in recent years it has occasionally pushed past a full meter annually. The surface now sits at roughly 440 meters below sea level, compared to about 390 meters back in 1930. That means the lake has dropped by close to 50 meters in under a century, with most of that loss happening in just the last several decades. The shallow southern end of the lake could not survive that kind of loss. Historically, that section rarely exceeded about 6 meters in depth, so it depended entirely on staying connected to the deeper northern basin to remain a natural body of water at all. By the 1980s, it separated completely and dried into a network of industrial evaporation ponds. Companies in Israel and Jordan now pump lake water into those ponds on purpose, letting it evaporate so they can harvest potash, magnesium chloride, and other minerals used in fertilizer, cosmetics, and de-icing products. Most tourists floating near the southern resorts today are actually floating in an artificial pond covering tens of square miles, not the natural lake their grandparents once visited. All of this made the Dead Sea a strange mix of a shrinking natural wonder and an active industrial site at the same time. Exploring it stopped being a simple matter of curiosity. It became expensive, complicated, and split between a natural lake and a man-made one, with the two barely resembling each other anymore. None of this explains the biggest reason nobody dove into the lake for generations. That reason had nothing to do with money or industry. It came down to something far more physical. The divers who risked being blinded. The Dead Sea earns its fame because people float on it without even trying. Water that's salty is nearly a quarter denser than ordinary seawater, so a human body barely sinks at all. That same density makes swimming underwater on purpose brutally difficult, since a diver has to fight the water's natural push back toward the surface with every stroke, using far more effort than a normal dive requires. The bigger danger has nothing to do with floating. Getting even a small splash of dead seawater in the eyes causes intense burning and can seriously damage vision. Swallowing a mouthful is far worse. The extreme salt content can make the throat swell almost immediately, which can lead to choking within moments. For decades, this alone kept most divers and researchers away, since ordinary diving gear was not built for a liquid capable of injuring someone this quickly, and no standard training program prepared divers for it either. That changed in 2010 when a team from Ben Gurion University in Israel partnered with the Max Planck Institute for Marine Microbiology in Germany to run the first real scientific diving expedition into the lake. The divers wore full face masks that sealed off their eyes and mouths completely, since even brief contact with the water was considered too risky to leave any skin exposed. Every part of the equipment had to be checked against the same question, whether it could hold up against a liquid this corrosive for the length of an entire dive. What they went looking for was surprisingly simple. For years, people had noticed strange rippled patterns on the surface near the shore, patterns that suggested something was pushing up from below. Nobody had ever confirmed what caused them because nobody had gone down to look. The rings had been speculated about for decades, treated as one of those small local mysteries nobody had the means or the nerve to solve. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The divers found their answer almost immediately, and it turned out to be far bigger and far stranger than a few ripples on the surface. The craters that shouldn't have had life in them. Beneath the ripples, the divers found dozens of massive craters carved into the lake floor, some more than 45 feet across and 60 feet deep, with steep walls layered like rings in a tree trunk. Fresh water was pouring up out of these craters from underground aquifers, jetting into the salty lake above like an upside-down waterfall at depths reaching around 100 feet from the surface. That alone would have been a major discovery. What made headlines was what the divers found growing around the edges of those craters. Thick mats of bacteria covered the rocks in some spots, forming a level of biological richness nobody expected to exist in a lake famous for having no life in it at all. The open water of the Dead Sea is genuinely close to sterile, holding only a few thousand microscopic organisms per milliliter, almost all of them a hardy, salt-loving type of organism called archaea. But right at the boundary where fresh water met salt water inside these craters, researchers found communities far denser and more varied than anywhere else measured in the lake. Green biofilms covered the tops of some rocks, using both sunlight and natural sulfur compounds from the springs to survive. Researchers admitted these microbes appeared to tolerate sudden swings between fresh water and extreme salt water, something almost no known organism can handle. since salt-loving microbes usually die the moment they touch fresh water and vice versa. Scientists studying the lake had recorded only 2 visible algae blooms in decades of observation, one in 1980 and another in 1992, both brief and both treated as rare anomalies at the time. The crater communities suggested something different, a permanent and thriving ecosystem hiding at the edges of springs that almost nobody had ever mapped. The 2010 dive was only a first look. A second expedition followed in 2011 to study the springs further, and the results were published in a peer-reviewed journal the following year. That research proved the Dead Sea was never as empty as its name suggested. But even those findings were not the strangest things scientists would eventually pull out of that lake floor. The chimneys that kept growing anyway. More than a decade after the craters were mapped, researchers were still sending divers back down to understand how the shrinking lake was reshaping its own floor. In 2024, a team led by hydrogeologist Christian Siebert at Germany's Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research found something nobody had documented before anywhere in the Dead Sea. Towering mineral chimneys, some over 20 feet tall and up to 3 feet wide, standing upright on the lake bed and releasing a shimmering fluid into the water around them. The formations look almost identical to hydrothermal vents found deep in the ocean, structures usually created by scorching hot water rising from volcanic activity below the seafloor. These chimneys form through a completely different process, one with no heat involved at all. Groundwater from the surrounding desert seeps down into old, thick layers of buried salt beneath the lake, dissolving them into an extremely concentrated brine. That brine rises up through the lake floor, and the instant it touches the Dead Sea's own water, the dissolved minerals crystallize on contact, building solid chimney walls that can grow several centimeters taller in a single day. Researchers confirmed the source of these chimneys using a rare radioactive isotope that only forms from cosmic rays hitting the atmosphere, along with genetic traces of freshwater microbes carried down from the aquifers above. Both pointed to the same conclusion. The salt fueling these towers came from underground, not from the lake itself. 10 different research institutions worked together across fields ranging from mineralogy to microbiology just to confirm how the structures were forming. What made the discovery matter beyond its strangeness was its usefulness. Scientists realized these chimneys formed through the exact same underground process responsible for the lake's most dangerous ongoing hazard, a hazard that has been damaging the region for decades and still cannot be reliably predicted. The sinkholes. Nobody can fully predict. As the Dead Sea has kept shrinking, it has left behind something the tourism industry never wanted. Thousands of sinkholes now scar the shoreline, most of them concentrated along the western coast, with more than 6,000 documented since the 1980s and new ones still forming every year. Some researchers who track the numbers closely put the current count well above 7,000. The cause traces back to the same underground salt layers behind the mineral chimneys. As the lake retreats, fresh groundwater from the surrounding hills flows into salt deposits that used to sit safely underwater. That fresh water dissolves the salt, hollowing out cavities beneath the surface. Eventually, the ground above a cavity can no longer support its own weight, and it collapses without warning, sometimes creating holes tens of meters wide and deep enough to swallow a building. Researchers studying the affected shoreline have calculated an average subsidence rate of close to 0.5 meter per year across the areas most at risk. These collapses forced the closure of Ein Gedi, one of the most popular resort areas on the Israeli side of the lake, back in 2016. Roads have been abandoned, farmland destroyed, and entire stretches of shoreline fenced off as unsafe. The very first documented sinkhole incident dates back to January of 1998, when an 8-meter deep hole suddenly opened at a lakeside campsite. Researchers studying the problem have openly admitted that predicting exactly where the next sinkhole will open remains extremely difficult, since the ground can look completely solid right up until the moment it gives way. The discovery of the underwater mineral chimneys gave scientists their first real early warning tool, since chimneys tend to form in the same underground channels that later produce sinkholes on land. That connection is still being studied, and researchers from 10 different institutions were involved in confirming it. The lake that once seemed too dead to matter had become one of the more actively studied hazard zones in the region. Strangely, the organism responsible for the Dead Sea's biggest contribution to science had nothing to do with sinkholes or springs. It came from something far smaller, and its story reached all the way to Stockholm. The microbe that won a Nobel Prize. Long before anyone dove into the lake's craters, scientists already knew tiny organisms were surviving inside the Dead Sea itself. In the late 1960s, researchers isolated a salt-loving microbe from the lake and eventually named it Haloarcula maris mortui, using the Latin phrase for Dead Sea. For decades, it remained a minor curiosity, interesting mainly to specialists who studied organisms capable of surviving extreme salt, with little reason for anyone outside that small field to take notice. That changed when structural biologist Ada Yonath began searching for an organism whose internal machinery was tough enough to survive being crystallized for detailed study under an X-ray beam. Most organisms fall apart under that kind of stress, since the process needed to grow usable crystals is harsh enough to destroy delicate biological structures. The Dead Sea microbe, built to survive one of the harshest environments on the planet, held together far better than expected, producing crystals that steadily improved in quality across more than a decade of refinement. That discovery helped launch a research race involving multiple labs around the world. In 1998, researcher Thomas Stites at Yale used crystals grown from the same Dead Sea organism to solve the structure of the ribosome's large subunit, the cellular machine responsible for building every protein in a living cell. By 2000, his lab and others had mapped that structure down to the level of individual atoms. In 2009, Stites, Yonath, and a third researcher named Venkatraman Ramakrishnan shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for that work, research that has since guided the design of newer antibiotics that specifically target the ribosome of harmful bacteria. A microbe pulled from a lake, many people assumed held no life at all, ended up sitting at the center of one of modern biology's most important discoveries. It remains one of the more overlooked facts about a body of water most people only know for its salt and its selfies. What it all adds up to. Put the full picture together and a clear pattern shows up. A slow loss of river water broke a chemical balance that held steady for roughly 3 centuries. The shrinking lake split itself in two, turning half of it into an industrial evaporation site, while the same shrinking process filled its shoreline with thousands of unpredictable sinkholes. Its extreme chemistry kept most explorers away entirely, until specialized divers finally risked it and found freshwater craters, dense microbial life, and mineral chimneys never documented before 2024. None of it was guesswork. The spring research was published in 2012. The chimney findings appeared in Science of the Total Environment in 2024, and the Nobel Prize tied to this lake's own microbe is a matter of public record. The Dead Sea earned its name because nothing visible seemed to live in it. What people overlooked for centuries was everything happening beneath that still, salty surface. If this video gave you something, subscribing takes 3 seconds, and it helps us keep making content like this.